Welcome to this video in the QPSMR Companion Digging Deeper series. In this video we're going to be looking at changing and correcting data. So we have here a project and we've got a number of questions and some variables in this questionnaire as well. And what we're going to be looking at is what we can do to change that data and actually view that data or even export it, although we're not going to cover exporting in this particular video. That's covered separately. So for this, I'm going to go to the data menu, and you can see in here there's various options. Viewing just means that you can open the file without actually being able to change the data, but I'm going to go into the update data file menu here, open the data file, and we can see here that I've got 4 records, and these are the answers to those 4 records. So there's a number of things that I can do when I'm in this screen here, and I can actually carry out checks on my data, or I can actually physically change my data or even delete records if I wish to as well. So let's just work along here and see the things that we can do. Well, first of all, of course, I can save the data if I wish to, or save it as a different file name. I can just save the rows that I viewed, and only output a segment of the data if I wish to. So that's all fairly self-explanatory. When we come to the checks, what this will do for you is it will check your data to ensure that all the things that you've got set are correct, and if they're not, or they're illogical, that they'll get flagged for you in a short report, or hopefully a short report. So the sorts of things that we can check here, we can check any hold filters that have been used. So that for those who don't know what a hold filter is, they're filters in data entry that get triggered if something is illogical. So an example of that might be where you're adding up some percentages to add to 100%, and that figure might, that filter rather, might be triggered if the figures that have been entered don't add to 100%, only add to 95%, shall we say. So we can leave that checked on, which is the default, so that any hold filters in your questionnaire actually get triggered. And likewise down here, we can check for any fields that are empty, that shouldn't be empty. And down here, and probably one of the most important ones, that all of the values that are out of range are also flagged as well. And this is particularly important if we're bringing in data from another source. So maybe you've imported the data from somewhere else or another piece of software, and it'll be a very good starting point to check this file to make sure that everything that's in it, all the contents, are logically consistent with your questionnaire, because it could be you've made an error in your questionnaire and you need to add a code or change a filter or something like that. Also, you can check for invalid responses, filtered responses, checking that questions that should be single are single, and so on. So all of the things that you might want to check can be turned on and off here. I find the default's actually a pretty good starting point and tend to stick with them as the things that I check when I'm working with data. And we can perform a whole file check here by clicking on this, and as you saw there, nothing come up at the screen, so there were no errors, but we'll look at some errors coming up in a minute. In the edit menu here, we can, if we wish to, delete selected rows. So if I highlighted a particular row and deleted that record would just disappear from the file, so that when we saved it, it would be no longer there. In the archive file, that original data is still preserved though, so you can go down the archive file and restore that data if you've accidentally deleted, for example. Here you can just add in a record if you want to, in paper mode if you want to add a record in, so you can just key in an extra record, and it's another way of getting, if you like, into the data entry screens that are applicable for adding a paper record. And that's covered in another video, a separate video. In the view column, you can choose what you view. So you can choose whether you view all the columns, or if you're working on a particular column or set of columns, you could, for example, just view selected entries. So you might not want to see all the data. In this particular questionnaire, we've only got a small number of fields, so it's very easy to view at one screen. But if you had a full questionnaire, maybe with 500 fields, you would probably or possibly want to just restrict what you could view in terms of columns. And likewise with the rows as well. You can, if you wish to, show all rows, or something that I certainly like to do when I'm getting a new set of data or imported data is to just see the rows that have errors in them so that you can work through those. So if you've got a file of 1,000 records that you've imported, you might want to just check any error rows and correct them or do whatever's necessary to make them fit in with your survey data. And here you've got the ability to export the data to a spreadsheet or a CSV file so that you can look at it outside of QPS if you wish to, or perhaps share it with a client. So we're going to take a look at the data we have here now, and just first of all to understand what we've got at the screen here. So this is a list of serial numbers. This is their sequential number in the file. This is the serial number, which of course in this particular data file is the same thing. And these are the codes that have been stored for each question. Now you'll note here, question 3, for example, is a multi-code, so that actually has a 2-3 in there, which means that both 2 and 3 were selected. And you can see that there's a mouse over there so that you can hold the mouse against that to see what responses actually were. So you can see there that I was getting the 2 magazines, in fact. And at question 2 here, I'm putting the mouse over the 2 there, which says most days. So any of these answers here, you can hover with the mouse and you can actually see what text that applies or is applicable to that particular code if you're not sure. So any single questions or numeric questions like question 7 here are shown just as they appear, but any questions where multi-responses are allowed are just, if you like, delimited or separated by a space. So this means 2 and 3, this means 3 and 5, and so on. I think that's there's another multi-coded question here. We've got 3 and 4, and this one here has got codes 1, 2, and something else. We could widen that. We go 1, 2, and 6, can see the codes for the second record there at question 6. And by hovering over the mouse, again, we can see the texts that are applicable. Now, to change the data is very simple. You can just go into this here, and you can change that. So we're editing that, and we're going to type a 2 in there, and that has changed record 2 to answer 2 at question number 1. Now actually, if we go back to look at our questionnaire underneath here, you'll see that that's actually generated an error, because the only people who should answer question 2 are those that said yes at question 1. So question 1 was a yes/no question. There's a filter here of question 1, answer 1, and only people who said 1 at question 1 should answer question 2. So if we run a check now and check the whole file, you'll see, for example, that serial number 2 at entry Q2 has come up with an error, and it says filtered question contains data. So that would give us an opportunity to either turn this back to a code 1 so that it was logically correct, or we could go in here and delete that code so that the code for question 2 was removed, because that's just not correct if we have a 2 at question 1. So I'm going to set that back to question 1. Let's look at something else now. Let's change this code to a 7. Now question 1 doesn't have a 7 as a valid code. It only has 1 and 2. So let's see what happens when we run that. We check again, check the whole file, and again you can see that what we've got now is that we've got serial number 4 coming up with answer 7 at question 1, which then in turn causes question 2 to error because it's not satisfying the filter. So that we're actually getting 2 errors because, if you like, of 1 error in our data file. We could save that if we wanted to with that error, and it will repeat that for us there and tell us that we've got an error. And what it's doing now is taking that code away because it's not a valid code. So we've now got this as an empty cell. And again, if we check this, we get that error coming up. And if we change our checks to show empties as well and run it again, we should get a whole series of errors now, because we've got question 1 coming up with no data when it shouldn't be empty. Q2 with the filtered error, and question 7 along here is also blank. So by checking the empty checkbox here, we're also picking up another potential error, although of course we could allow empty as being valid. So let's set this data back, or let's just run a report first to get a summary and see what we've got here. So I'm going to run a summary now on this option under the report menu. And what this does, gives you a count for each question. So what we can see here now is we've got 4 respondents. One of them is empty at this question. So again, we can quickly see the empties down here. 3 have got this code, none have got this code. If that code 7 was still there, we'd get an unknown code showing here, and we can perhaps look at that in a minute. But you can see we get a good summary here of the base for each question and how many records are failing at each particular question or field. So let's close that. Let's go back and correct this data. And let's put a sensible figure in here like 20. And let's see if our data now is logically correct. And you can see it went through with no errors. And if we run a report now, you can see that everything is coming up as completed data. So our data looks consistent. Now, another type of error that you might want to pick up is a number that's too big. And this can certainly be a problem when you import from another piece of software. So I think the field for question 7 here is a maximum of 4 digits. So let's up this figure here from 40 to 10,000. And you can see it's let me do that. Let's just widen that column so we can see it. There it is at 10,000. And again, if we run our check, you can see that the value is coming up as out of range, so that we can go back in there and change that to 100 or 200. I've made it there easily. So really that's the essence of how you work around the data changing and correcting and checking module. Let's have a little bit of a look at one or two other things here quickly while we're doing that. So we can just save the viewed rows, as that was mentioned just now. We can just save selected rows. We can run checks on all or some of these different types of checks that are allowed. We've looked at deleting and adding a new row. We haven't actually added it, but that just fires up the paper data entry. And we could decide to view just selected columns and so on. The final thing that we're going to look at now is exporting. So if we want to export this data to a spreadsheet, we can just click on this option here, or a CSV file. And now that data is in a spreadsheet so that it can be shared with colleagues or clients. And we could just highlight certain rows here if we wanted to as well. And indeed, it's possible to make changes in this spreadsheet and load that back in to QPSMR Companion. So let's close this now. And let's go back to the data menu. So just have a quick look at some of the other things on this menu. We can merge data from another file if we want to build a file, maybe from 2 or 3 or even more files. We're not going to be covering weighting data in this video. That's covered in a separate video. Viewing is the same as updating, except you can't actually physically update it. Exporting means that you can export the data to one of the other many formats that QPSMR supports, and that's covered in another video. And we can look at a list of the empty records here. Now, another feature that's quite useful is the check data file option that's available here. So let's click on that, open the data file, and again we get the errors coming up. But what you get here is a list or a summary, if you like, of all of the failures, so that you can go further into this, so that you can open the data file, you can look at the log, but you get a summary of all the different types of errors that it's found in your data. And this is a very good way of sort of, proceeding, if you like, particularly from paper questionnaires or imported data through perhaps an editing process and a cleaning process to getting final data that you want to analyze. So that's something else that I would certainly recommend that people run before they actually start doing their analysis. Now, the final thing we're going to look at is just sort of some things that help you to work with the data you have and make sure you've got the records that you've got. So if I go back to the view or the update menu here, open up my data. I've got an error in the data here, as we know at the moment. But in the reports, there's options to not only get a summary, but a list all of the serial numbers that we have. So I can click on this button here, and this tells me I've got 4 records on file. The lowest is 1, and they run through from 1 to 4. And if I had any missing serial numbers, it would tell me any missing serial numbers here. And that can be quite useful if you're expecting 1 to 1,000 to be present and one of them is missing or some are missing. You can immediately see what records you have missing. Well, that's given you an overview of looking around your data, changing your data, correcting your data, and producing some reports when you're checking your data. I hope that was useful to you. And of course, there's many more videos in the QPSMR Companion Going Deeper series. Thank you.